Why did this happen? That is the singular, haunting question that has echoed through the corridors of history for over 3 millennia. Why did a group of 50 heroes, led by a man with only one sandal, ventured into the forbidden corners of the world? Only to realize too late that the ocean was never meant to be conquered. We often look at the myth of Jason and the Argonauts as a simple tale of heroism, a quest for a golden prize. But if you listen closely to the whispers of the Aegean, you'll hear a different story. A story of a voyage that didn't just cross the water, but disturbed something ancient. Something primordial that had been sleeping beneath the waves since the dawn of the Titans. Welcome to Chronicle Nexus, where today we pull back the veil on the legendary expedition of the Argo. And the terrifying realization that some treasures are guarded by more than just dragons. The story begins not with a hero, but with a prophecy and a heart cold with fear. In the city of Iolcus, King Pelias sat upon a stolen throne, his knights haunted by a warning from the oracle, "Beware the man with one sandal." When Jason, the rightful heir, arrived in the city after losing a sandal in the muddy banks of the Anauros River, Pelias knew his time was short. But rather than face the young man in open combat, the king chose a more devious path. He tasked Jason with the impossible, to travel to the distant edge of the known world, to the kingdom of Colchis, and bring back the golden fleece. The shimmering hide of a divine ram, a symbol of kingship and divine favor. It was a suicide mission, a death sentence wrapped in the gilded language of glory. But Jason did not falter. He called upon the greatest craftsman of Greece to build a vessel unlike any the world had ever seen. This was the Argo, a ship constructed under the watchful eye of the goddess Athena herself. It wasn't just wood and iron, it was a living thing. A beam of sacred oak from the grove of Dodona was set into the prow, a piece of timber that possessed the gift of speech and prophecy. When the Argo hit the water, the splash wasn't just a sound, it was a signal. It was a heartbeat that vibrated through the depths, a rhythmic thrumming that reached down into the dark trenches where the old gods and the ancient terrors of the deep had retreated. Jason didn't go alone. He gathered the Argonauts, a pantheon of mortal legends. There was Hercules, whose strength could move mountains, Orpheus, whose music could soothe the wildest beast, the twin Boreads, who could fly on the wind, and many others, each a master of their craft. As they pulled their oars in perfect unison, the Argo cut through the waves with an unnatural speed. For the first few days, the sun was bright and the wind was fair. The heroes laughed, toasted to their future glory, and dreamt of the gold that awaited them. They felt like masters of the sea. However, as they moved further from the familiar shores of Greece, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient salt. The water changed from a vibrant blue to a deep, bruised purple, almost black. It was here, amidst the silence of the open sea, that the crew first felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of their necks. They thought they were the hunters, the brave adventurers on a righteous quest. But as the horizon stretched infinitely before them, a chilling thought began to take root in Jason's mind. There was something we didn't understand about the nature of the fleece and the journey required to reach it. You see, the golden fleece wasn't just a trophy. It was a tether between the mortal realm and the divine, and by moving toward it, the Argonauts were inadvertently crossing a boundary that had been sealed for eons. The sea wasn't just a highway, it was a tomb, and their oars were knocking on the lid. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a monster, but from the water itself. The waves began to move against the wind, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if something gargantuan was breathing far beneath the hull. The talking prow of the Argo, once a source of guidance, fell silent, its wooden eyes staring into the mist with what could only be described as terror. The Argonauts' first major trial brought them to the island of Lemnos, a place inhabited only by women who had murdered their husbands. On the surface, it seemed like a welcome distraction from the rigors of the sea, but the air on Lemnos was stagnant, smelling of old blood and broken vows. It was a precursor to the darkness they were inviting. From there, they navigated the Hellespont, entering the Propontis, where they encountered the Gaganes, 6 armed giants born of the earth. These were not mere animals. They were remnants of an older world, guardians of the threshold that Jason was so recklessly crossing. Hercules fought them back with his legendary strength, but even he noticed that for every giant they slew, the sea seemed to grow more agitated, the tides more violent. They were waking the world up. Every league they covered toward Colchis was a needle prick into the hide of a sleeping Leviathan. By the time they reached the land of the Bebrices and the kingdom of King Phineus, the Argonauts were no longer the confident heroes who had left Iolcus. Phineus, a seer cursed by Zeus to be forever hungry while harpies stole his food, gave them a glimpse into the horror that lay ahead. He spoke of the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. These were 2 massive cliffs of stone that sat at the mouth of the Bosphorus, smashing together with the force of 1,000 thunderclaps, crushing any ship that dared to pass between them. Most historians treat the Symplegades as a geographical metaphor, but for Jason, they were the jaws of the world. As the Argo approached the narrow strait, the very earth seemed to groan. The Argonauts watched in horror as the sea between the rocks turned into a frothing cauldron of white foam and shattered timber from previous failed expeditions. They realized then that the something they had woken wasn't just a single creature, it was the environment itself. The world was trying to reject them. It was a frantic struggle for survival, a moment of pure, unadulterated tension, where the line between myth and nightmare blurred. And this last part is what we often miss when we read these ancient texts, the psychological toll on the men themselves. As they stood on the deck of the Argo, listening to the roar of the clashing rocks, they weren't just afraid of dying, they were afraid of what they had become. They were the intruders. They were the ones who had disturbed the silence of the deep. They had invited the gaze of entities that do not think like men, entities that see a ship not as a vessel of heroes, but as a parasite on the skin of the ocean. As we move deeper into this chronicle here on Chronicle Nexus, we must ask, what happens when the heroes realize that the prize they seek is the very thing that will lead to their destruction? Jason held the rudder, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the golden fleece waited, guarded by a dragon that never slept. But the dragon was only the beginning. The sea had finally fully awakened, and it was hungry. The Argo was no longer just a ship on a journey. It was a target. And as the Symplegades began to move, closing like the teeth of a trap, the Argonauts realized that the greatest danger wasn't what lay ahead in Colchis, but the sheer, ancient weight of the world they had so boldly decided to wake. Stay with us as we navigate the storm, for the path to the fleece is paved with more than just gold. It is paved with the echoes of those who dared to wake the sea and never returned. The Symplegades were not merely rocks, they were the manifestation of a primordial gatekeeper, a physical rejection of the human spirit trying to pierce the veil between the known and the unknown. As the Argo surged forward, the air grew thick with the smell of pulverized stone and ancient brine. The sound was deafening, a rhythmic, thunderous boom that felt less like geology and more like a heartbeat. Every man on that ship, from the mighty Heracles to the rhythmic Orpheus, felt the vibration in their marrow. This was the first true evidence that the sea had indeed woken up, and it was angry. They released a dove, a fragile flicker of white against the obsidian terror of the clashing cliffs. As the bird flew, the rocks slammed together with a force that could have leveled mountains, snatching only a few tail feathers from the dove before rebounding. That was the window. That was the sliver of hope the gods allowed them. But as the Argonauts rode, their muscles tearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps, the water beneath them began to churn in an unnatural way. It wasn't just the displacement of the rocks. It was as if the depths were reaching up to pull them back. The Argo's keel groaned, a sound that scholars suggest was the ship itself crying out. For remember, the Argo was built with a piece of the sacred speaking oak of Dodona. It wasn't just a vessel, it was a living witness to their hubris. They made it through, but not unscathed. The stern ornament was sheared off, a permanent scar on the ship that served as a reminder, the world doesn't want you to succeed. And as the mist cleared on the other side of the strait, the atmosphere shifted. The light was different here. The water turned a bruised shade of purple, and the stars seemed to align in patterns that defied the maps of the Greeks. They had entered the Euxine Sea, but in reality, they had entered a realm where the laws of man were secondary to the whims of the ancient. This brings us to a chilling realization. Why was the journey so fraught with impossible obstacles? Actually, there was something we didn't understand yet. The fleece wasn't just a prize or a trophy of kingship. Ancient texts and whispers from the cults of Hecate suggest that the golden fleece was a bridge between the celestial and the terrestrial. By seeking it, Jason wasn't just claiming a throne, he was attempting to seize a piece of the divine fabric that held the world together. The sea wasn't just waking because a ship was passing through. It was waking because the balance of the universe was being tilted by mortal hands. As they neared the shores of Colchis, the tension among the crew shifted from external fear to internal rot. The Argonauts were the greatest heroes of their age, but even they weren't immune to the psychological pressure of being in a land that felt wrong. Colchis was the edge of the world, ruled by King Aeetes, a man who claimed descent from the sun itself. But his power didn't feel like the warmth of a summer afternoon. It felt like the searing, blinding heat of a desert that consumes everything it touches. Aeetes received them not with open arms, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator watching a moth flutter into a web. He didn't deny Jason the fleece. Instead, he gave him a task that was designed not to be a test of skill, but a death sentence. Jason had to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls, the Calcatauroi, creatures of bronze and flame that snorted embers and moved with a terrifying mechanical precision. Then he had to plow a field and sow it with the teeth of a dragon. Think about the symbolism here. To sow the earth with teeth is to plant violence. And from that violence grew the Spartoi, warriors of bone and steel who rose from the soil with one singular purpose: to kill the intruder. Jason stood in the middle of that field, the smell of burning earth filling his lungs, facing an army that didn't know how to retreat. Here we see the shift in the narrative. Jason, the leader, the hero, realizes that his sword and his strength are utterly useless. He is a man out of his depth, drowning in a sea of magic he cannot comprehend. This is where the shadow of the quest truly deepens. Jason's salvation didn't come from his own bravery, but from a betrayal. Medea, the daughter of the king and a high priestess of Hecate, saw something in Jason, or perhaps something moved within her that was darker than love. She provided the ointments to protect him from the fire, the stones to confuse the skeleton warriors, and the charms to lull the guardians. But at what cost? The something they woke in the sea had now followed them onto land, manifesting as a dark, obsessive magic that would eventually tear Jason's life apart. The trials in the field were just the beginning. As Jason stood over the bodies of the fallen Spartoi, the earth beneath Colchis seemed to hum with a low, vibrating frequency. The atmosphere grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient blood. The crew of the Argo, watching from a distance, realized that the air itself was changing. They had successfully navigated the physical traps of the sea, but now they were trapped in a spiritual vacuum. And this final part is what we often miss. The Golden Fleece was never meant to be guarded by a dragon that simply slept or watched. The dragon of Colchis was a creature that never closed its eyes, not for a second, not for an eon. It was a physical manifestation of eternal vigilance. The dragon wasn't just protecting the gold, it was protecting the world from the gold. The fleece represented a power so volatile, so untethered from the mortal coil, that it required a monster of infinite wakefulness to keep it contained. When Jason and Medea approached the sacred grove of Ares where the fleece hung, the silence was more terrifying than the roar of the Symplegades. The trees were draped in shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. And there, coiled around the oak tree, was the serpent. Its scales were like tarnished silver, and its eyes were two glowing orbs of unblinking malice. It didn't roar, it hissed, a sound that felt like the grinding of tectonic plates. The Argonauts thought they were the hunters, the brave explorers bringing light to the dark corners of the map. But in that grove, under the watchful, unblinking eyes of the serpent, the truth became clear. They were thieves in the house of a god. They had disturbed a silence that had lasted since the dawn of time. Every step Jason took towards the fleece was a step towards a curse that would echo through his lineage for generations. They weren't just stealing gold, they were stealing the peace of the world. As Medea began her incantations, her voice dropping into a register that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth, the serpent's head began to sway. This wasn't a victory of steel, it was a victory of forbidden knowledge. The dragon's eyelids, heavy with the weight of centuries, began to flutter. For the first time in history, the eternal watcher was being forced to succumb to a dream. But as the dragon's eyes closed, the sea back at the shore began to boil. The something they had woken was no longer just watching from the depths. It was coming for them. The price of the fleece was being tallied, and the debt would be paid in blood, madness, and the slow, agonizing erosion of everything Jason held dear. The journey back would not be a victory lap. It would be a desperate flight from the very shadows they had invited into their souls. The golden fleece did not shimmer with the warmth of a sunrise, as the legends often suggest. Up close, clutched in Jason's trembling hands, it radiated a cold, sickly pallor, a light that didn't illuminate the darkness so much as it bruised it. It was heavy, far heavier than any ram's skin should be, weighted down by the metaphysical gravity of 1,000 broken oaths. As the Argonauts scrambled back toward the ship, the very air seemed to thicken with a metallic tang, the smell of ozone and ancient, disturbed earth. They had done the impossible, but as they stepped onto the deck of the Argo, there was no cheering. There was only the sound of the hull groaning against a sea that had turned into a viscous obsidian soup. The something that had woken was not a single beast, but a collective realization of the natural order that had been violated. The fleece was the heartbeat of Colchis, the anchor of a primordial power, and by severing it, Jason had ripped a hole in the fabric of the world. The boiling sea wasn't just heat, it was a fever. The earth was trying to purge the infection that the Argonauts had become. As the oars hit the water, the wood of the Argo, infused with the speaking oak of Dodona, didn't just creak. It let out a low, vibrating hum that sounded suspiciously like a funeral dirge. As it turns out, there was something we hadn't yet understood about the nature of Jason's quest. We often view the golden fleece as a trophy, a prize to be won to reclaim a throne. But the ancients understood a darker truth. Some things are kept hidden not to protect the object, but to protect the world from the object. The fleece was a reservoir of divine trauma, a remnant of the golden ram that had flown through the heavens to save children from sacrifice, only to be sacrificed itself. It was a cycle of blood that demanded more blood to remain dormant. By taking it, Jason hadn't just ended a quest, he had inherited an ancient, insatiable hunger. The pursuit began not with a roar, but with a terrifying silence. King Aeetes did not immediately launch his fleet. Instead, the sky over Colchis turned the color of a fresh bruise. The Argonauts watched as the coastline began to warp, the trees bending toward the sea as if reaching for them. Medea stood at the stern, her eyes no longer the eyes of the girl who had fallen in love, but the hollowed-out voids of a priestess who had seen the end of time. She knew what was coming. She knew that the sea was no longer their path home. It was a courtroom, and the prosecution was closing in. The first manifestation of the debt occurred when the wind died. For 3 days, they sat in a dead calm. The water around the Argo turning into a mirror, so perfect it was suffocating. In that reflection, the Argonauts didn't see themselves. They saw versions of who they were becoming, gaunt, hollowed-out men with eyes full of shadows. The fleece, draped over a chest in the center of the deck, began to pulse. Every time it pulsed, one of the men would scream in his sleep, dreaming of a golden light that flayed the skin from their bones. Then came the pursuit. The Colchian fleet appeared on the horizon, but they didn't sail like normal ships. They moved with a supernatural speed, propelled by the sheer, focused rage of a father betrayed and a king robbed. At the head of the fleet was Absyrtus, Medea's own brother. This is where the story shifts from a grand adventure into a psychological horror. The Argonauts, once the greatest heroes of Greece, Orpheus, Peleus, the Boreads, found themselves looking to a teenage girl for salvation. And the salvation she offered was a nightmare. To slow the pursuit, Medea committed an act so heinous that it stained the Argo's soul forever. She lured her brother Absyrtus to a peaceful meeting and helped Jason murder him. But they didn't just kill him. To ensure their escape, they dismembered him, casting his limbs into the sea one by one. They knew King Aeetes would be forced to stop his fleet to collect the pieces of his son for a proper burial. As the bloody fragments hit the water, the boiling sea finally calmed, but the silence that followed was worse than any storm. The water didn't wash the blood away. It seemed to absorb it, turning a deep, bruised purple. The heroes were no longer heroes. They were fugitives, carrying a cursed hide and the ghost of a butchered prince. They began to notice that the Argo itself was changing. The ivory and oak were turning gray. The something in the sea was no longer chasing them from behind. It was beneath them. It was the weight of the sacrilege they had committed. The fleece grew heavier with every mile. It was no longer a coat of gold. It felt like a leaden shroud. Jason, once charismatic and bold, began to shrink. He spent his hours staring at the fleece, his skin taking on a yellowish, sickly hue, reflecting the very object he had fought so hard to obtain. They fled through the Ister, through the Danube, navigating rivers that shouldn't have existed, as if the geography of the world was warping to keep them away from the civilized world. They were being funneled toward the edge of the map, toward places where the gods themselves feared to tread. The crew began to turn on one another. Orpheus tried to play his lyre to soothe their souls, but the strings snapped, one by one, as if the air itself refused to carry a beautiful melody. The only sound left was the rhythmic thump-thump of the fleece's pulse, echoing the heartbeat of the dead Absyrtus. And this final part is what we often miss when we talk about the return of the Argonauts. Most retellings focus on the monsters they faced, the sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, as external obstacles. But if you look deeper into the ancient text, these weren't just random encounters. They were manifestations of the crew's decaying morality. The sirens didn't just sing beautiful songs. They sang the Argonauts' own justifications back to them, making their crimes sound like necessities. The monsters weren't blocking their path. They were welcoming them home. The sea had woken because the Argonauts had brought something unnatural back into the world. The golden fleece was never meant to return to the world of men. It was a celestial anomaly, a gift from the gods that had been returned through sacrifice. By taking it back, Jason had reversed a divine transaction. The debt wasn't just about the blood of Absyrtus. It was about the fundamental balance of life and death. As they approached the island of Circe, the dread reached a breaking point. They didn't seek her out for hospitality. They sought her for exorcism. They needed the goddess of magic to wash the blood of a brother off their hands. But as the Argo pulled into the harbor of Aea, the ship itself seemed to scream. The wooden mast groaned a final warning. The price has not been paid. It has only been deferred. Jason looked out at the horizon and realized that the something in the sea hadn't stopped following them. It was waiting just outside the reef, a shadow larger than any whale, a darkness that was patient, ancient, and hungry. They hadn't escaped Colchis. They had merely brought the darkness of the east back to the west, and the golden fleece was the beacon that would guide that darkness to everything Jason ever loved. The triumph was a hollow shell, and inside, the rot was already beginning to spread. They weren't coming home as kings. They were coming home as carriers of a divine plague. The silence on the Argo was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb held underwater. As the ship crested the swell of the open sea, the wind died down. Yet the vessel continued to move, propelled by a current that appeared on no map and obeyed no season. The Argonauts, men who had stared down giants and outmaneuvered gods, now found themselves huddled near the mast, eyes averted from the shimmering gold draped over the prow. The golden fleece didn't just glow, it pulsed. It had a rhythm, a slow, thrumming heartbeat that resonated through the timber of the ship and into the very marrow of their bones. They were beginning to realize that the fleece wasn't an object of victory. It was an organ, a still-beating piece of a cosmic entity that they had ripped from the throat of the world. And then the water changed. The deep blue of the Mediterranean began to thicken into a bruised purple, then a viscous, oily black. There were no fish here. No gulls followed their weight. The only thing in the water was the shadow, the thing that had been waiting just outside the reef. It wasn't following the Argo. It was pacing it, like a wolf walking alongside a cage. Every time a sailor looked over the railing, they didn't see their reflection. They saw a distorted version of their own face, aged by centuries, eyes hollowed out by a grief they hadn't yet lived. It was during these long, suffocating nights that the first realization hit them, the realization that defines the middle of every tragedy. We often think of Jason's journey as a quest for glory, a heroic heist to reclaim a throne. But as the Argo veered into the unknown currents of the Ister, a terrifying realization began to dawn on the crew. Ternyata ada sesuatu yang belum kita pahami. There was something about the Golden Fleece that the legends purposefully omitted. It wasn't a gift from the gods to signify kingship, it was a tether. A divine anchor meant to drag whatever touched it back down into the primordial depths from which all life and all monsters originally crawled. The air grew cold, a frost that smelled of copper and old blood. Medea, the princess who had betrayed her father and murdered her soul to save Jason, stood at the stern. She wasn't looking back at the pursuing Colchian fleet. She was looking down. She knew. She had always known that the fleece was never meant to leave the Grove of Ares. By taking it, they hadn't just stolen gold, they had broken a seal. The something they woke in the sea wasn't just a beast, it was a debt. A debt that the sea intended to collect in the currency of souls. Jason, once the golden boy of Iolcus, was the first to change. The charismatic leader who had inspired the greatest heroes of Greece began to wither. His skin took on a translucent, waxen hue. He spent hours whispering to the fleece, his words a frantic jumble of prayers and apologies. He could feel it, the rot mentioned before, spreading from the artifact into his mind. He wasn't becoming a king, he was becoming a vessel. The Argonauts started to whisper among themselves. They spoke of the fleece sickness, a lethargy that made their swords feel like lead, and their memories of home feel like dreams belonging to someone else. The conflict reached its breaking point when the shadow beneath the waves finally rose. It didn't emerge as a kraken or a serpent. It emerged as a sound. A low, vibrating hum that made the Argo's hull groan in agony. The wood began to weep sap that looked like blood. This was the sea's way of speaking, a vibration that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the conscience. It played back the screams of those they had killed to get here. It echoed the snap of the branches in the sacred grove. To escape the immediate pursuit of Medea's father, King Aeetes, the crew committed an act so heinous it stained the stars themselves. To buy time, Medea didn't just suggest a tactical retreat, she orchestrated the dismemberment of her own brother, Absyrtus. She lured him into a trap, and Jason, the hero, struck the blow. They threw the pieces of the prince's body into the sea. One by one, knowing the king would have to stop his fleet to collect the remains of his son for a proper burial. As the first piece of flesh hit the black water, the shadow beneath the boat didn't just swallow it, it ignited. The sea didn't want the prince, it wanted the transgression. The murder of kin on the high seas was the final key. The blood acted as a lubricant for the ancient gears of the world. Suddenly, the Argo wasn't just sailing through water, it was sailing through a rift. The geography became impossible. They found themselves in the Sirenum Scopuli, where the songs of the sirens weren't beautiful melodies, but the actual voices of the mothers and wives the Argonauts had left behind, screaming in eternal loneliness. This is the secret the poets rarely dwell on. The Argonauts weren't being tested by the gods, they were being erased by them. Every mile they traveled closer to home, they lost a piece of their humanity. Orpheus, the man whose music could move stones, found that his lyre now only produced the sound of breaking bones. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, stopped speaking to each other, their eyes reflecting a distance wider than the ocean. The golden fleece sat on its pedestal, soaking up their despair. It grew heavier. The ship began to sit lower in the water, the gunwales nearly touching the black brine. They realized then that the fleece wasn't the prize of the journey, it was the weight that would eventually sink them. They were carriers of a divine plague, yes, but they were also the fuel. The fleece was feeding on their kleos, their glory, turning it into something dark and heavy. They thought they were escaping the East, but the East was a state of mind, a land of ancient, unforgiving magic that they were now dragging into the rational, younger world of the West. The darkness that was patient and ancient wasn't just behind them, it was inside the ship, inside the fleece, and now inside Jason. The boy who wanted to be king was gone. In his place was a man who had realized that some things in the sea are better left sleeping. And some treasures are actually anchors, designed to keep you from ever reaching the shore of your own sanity. As they approached the swirling vortex of Charybdis and the snapping heads of Scylla, they didn't see them as monsters to be defeated. They saw them as the sea's white blood cells, trying to purge the infection that the Argo had become. The heroes were no longer the protagonists of an epic. They were the pathogens in a cosmic body, and the world was trying to vomit them out. The atmosphere on the ship had reached a fever pitch of dread. Every creak of the mast sounded like a verdict. Every splash of a wave felt like a reaching hand. They were halfway home, but home had never felt further away. They had the gold, they had the girl, they had the glory. But as they looked into the black, churning heart of the sea, they saw the truth. The sea hadn't just woken up because they stole the fleece. It had woken up because it finally had something to hunt that was worth the effort. They weren't just sailors anymore. They were the bait in a trap set by the universe itself. The shadows on the deck of the Argo grew longer, stretching like skeletal fingers as the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon. They had survived the clashing rocks. They had outrun the wrath of a king. But now, as they drifted into the deep, open waters of the Mediterranean, the silence was the most terrifying thing of all. This is where the legends usually gloss over the details, where the maps turn into blank parchment and the ink begins to bleed. And this last part is what we often miss. We think of the Golden Fleece as a trophy, a shimmering coat of victory. But for Jason and his crew, it was a lighthouse for every nightmare that dwelt beneath the waves. The sea wasn't just angry, it was hungry. It felt as though the very fabric of the world was trying to correct a mistake. By taking the fleece, they had stolen a piece of the divine, and the mortal world wasn't meant to hold it. As they sailed toward the island of the Sirens, the air turned thick and sweet, smelling of jasmine and decay. The Argonauts, men of iron and salt, began to weep. They didn't see monsters. They saw their mothers, their lost lovers, the lives they had traded for a piece of gold. They began to stand, their eyes glassy, ready to step into the abyss. But Orpheus, the man who could make stones cry, gripped his lyre until his knuckles turned white. He didn't just play music, he fought. He struck the strings with such violence that he drowned out the supernatural song. It was a battle of frequencies, the cold, dead call of the sea versus life. They survived, but the toll was visible. They were hollowed out. They weren't heroes anymore. They were survivors of a cosmic heist. Then came the giants. Not creatures of flesh and bone, but something far more unsettling. On the shores of Crete, they encountered Talos. Imagine a mountain made of bronze, a machine of the gods that shouldn't exist in a world of wood and leather. He was the first automaton, a relentless sentinel that circled the island 3 times a day, throwing boulders that could crush a galley like a dry leaf. This is where the something in the sea truly revealed its nature. Talos wasn't just a guard. He was the physical manifestation of the boundary between the human and the divine. To pass him, Jason didn't use a sword, he didn't use a spear, he used Medea. And this is the secret we rarely talk about. The Argonauts didn't win through bravery. They won through a darkness that made the sea itself recoil. Medea stood on the prow, her hair whipping like a nest of vipers, and she whispered to the bronze giant. She didn't use words of war. She used the language of the soul's deepest fears. She convinced the machine that it was mortal. She found the single bronze nail in his ankle, his only vulnerability, and drew it out. Not blood, but ichor, the golden fluid of the gods, spilled onto the sand. The giant fell with a sound that echoed across the Mediterranean, a metallic scream that told the world the old gods were bleeding. But here is the truth that Jason only realized when the shores of Iolcus finally appeared on the horizon. The sea didn't stop hunting them because they had reached home. It stopped hunting them because the damage was already done. Something they woke up wasn't a kraken or a storm. It was the realization that glory is a poison. Jason returned with the fleece. He stood before his uncle, King Peleus, and threw the shimmering gold onto the cold stone floor. But there was no cheering. There was no peace. The fleece brought only more blood. Medea, driven by the same dark forces that had guided them through the waves, tricked Peleus's own daughters into murdering him, thinking they were performing a ritual of rejuvenation. The hero who had braved the edge of the world was now a man without a country, an exile feared by everyone he had sworn to protect. Years later, an old man sat on a desolate beach, leaning against the rotting hull of a ship. It was the Argo. The once mighty vessel was now a skeleton of bleached wood, home to crabs and salt rot. The man was Jason. He had lost his wife, his children, and his crown. He had nothing left but the memory of that waking sea. As he closed his eyes, a final gust of wind shook the decaying timber. A heavy beam, the very prow that had once spoken with the voice of a goddess, snapped and fell. It crushed the man who had dared to wake the ocean. Jason didn't die in battle. He died under the weight of his own legend. The sea always gets its due. It didn't need to swallow the Argo in a storm. It just had to wait for the heroes to realize that some things are meant to stay buried in the deep. They stole the gold, they saw the truth, and in the end, the silence of the ocean was the only thing that remained. The story of the Argonauts isn't a story of triumph, it's a warning. When we reach too far into the unknown, when we wake the things that sleep in the black, churning heart of the universe, we don't just bring back a prize. We bring back a shadow that never leaves us. If you felt the chill of the ancient waves and the weight of the golden fleece, then you've walked the deck of the Argo with us today. This is the raw, unpolished edge of history and myth, the places where the light of the sun fails and the secrets of the deep begin. For more journeys into the shadows of our past and to uncover the mysteries that time tried to wash away, make sure to join our voyage. Subscribe to Chronicle Nexus and hit that like button if you're brave enough to wake what's sleeping. This is Chronicle Nexus, where the legends are real and the truth is deeper than the sea. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and watch what rises from the wake.